Quick introduction to Clark Richey, our final speaker today from FactGem, who you just heard about in the vendor spotlight. He's going to be talking about a very important component to becoming data-centric, and that's the business value associated with that and how to communicate and articulate that. So, Clark, I'm going to give you the floor to take it from here.
Hello. Welcome to the business value of data-centric thinking. Excuse me. I'm your presenter, Clark Richey. So we'll just start off briefly. I'll give you just the tiniest bit of background about myself. And I will say, well, I've done a number of conferences across my career and even some virtual. This is my first time where I can't actually see the audience in any way. So this is a new experience for me, doing this without any feedback. But we'll see how it goes. So I spent over 20 years building really large systems, mostly in the space of the US government and Department of Defense sectors. So as you can imagine, that's given me access to some really interesting and challenging problems in terms of big data. Prior to co-founding FactGem, the company where I am currently acting as the CTO, I was the director of public sector sales engineering at a good-sized database company called MarkLogic, headquartered out of Silicon Valley. So that's just a little bit about my background and sort of where I'm coming from in terms of my take on this. So on the next slide, you know, I was originally asked to give this talk, and I thought a lot about it. Why are we giving a talk in 2021 about the business value of data-centric thinking? Because it seemed to me like, well, everyone's probably doing this, right? Everyone is engaging in some way or another in data-centric decisions and thinking and moving their enterprise, their business in that direction. So I did a little research to better understand the context, and of course, there's a lot of fluffy sort of concepts around this, right? Data centricity, data driven. What do those things really mean? But one stat that really struck home for me is highlighted on that next slide. And that, of course, is that, and this is derived from a 2017 Forbes study. The link is here for you. So it's fairly recent, but only 45% of senior executives were including data or data analytics when making decisions. 45%. I'm hoping it's gone up a bit since 2017, but I'm not sure it's changed that dramatically. As I think back in a lot of conversations I've had with senior executives in various industries, it hasn't really changed that much, I don't think. So this was really eye-opening for me. And so, yeah, this is an important talk because we're not really there yet as an enterprise, as a community. We still have work to do here. So that's what kind of really excited me about this talk. So on the next slide, I just want to sort of set the stage again about where I'm going to go with this. What I'm not going to try to do is tell you how to run your business. I don't know your business. I don't know you. I can't even see you. I might be here all by myself. But obviously, data centricity, like any other complex or even interesting topic in business, is not a one-size-fits-all approach. There are, I think, general concepts and ideas that are worthwhile and valuable that can be applied to a lot of different scenarios, but not necessarily to all. Data centricity may not be where your business needs to go, or it may need to go there in a slightly different way based upon your specific needs. And I think that's perfectly appropriate. So that being said, let's go ahead and on the next slide and jump into some of the base concepts. I think it's important before we talk about data centricity um, to talk about being data driven. And I say this because, and we'll talk about this a little more in the upcoming slides, but organizations, enterprises typically don't just start out being data centric, right? It's a journey to get there. It's a progression. Um, and typically where people start out with that is in this concept of being data driven. So what do we mean by that? Um, well, data driven, in terms of rough concepts, um, really is just what it sounds like. Uh, it's about changing your culture to value the utility of data in making those business decisions. So it's getting your people within your organization to really understand that as we make a lot of these crucial business decisions, we need to have good data to support our hypotheses, to test them after we've made the decision to see if the outcome we've reached is appropriate, if it matches what we thought we would see. Um, it's really a cultural change first and foremost. And once the culture changes, you can start to implement technology changes, right? And I think this is I think that pattern is something we are seeing throughout any major technology change. You have to adopt a cultural change, an attitude change, a change in your beliefs, and then you can change your technology. So what happens when you do that? Well, one of the major things is this fosters tool development. So if you're going to decide to drive business decisions based on data, well, then you need good tools to collect the data, to persist the data, and of course, to perform analytics on the data and then display the results of those analytics in some way. That's a dashboard centric BI tool, some kind of report, charts, or even just, columns of numbers, whatever it might be. We've got to get those results out. And of course, one of the side effects of that is you end up with lots of applications potentially. And lots of applications can lead to having many views of your data. So we're going to explore this a little bit more with the help of the picture on the next slide. So here's just a notional uh, uh, data-driven enterprise, right? So very simply drawn here. Um, we may have decided we need 3 different applications. Could be in uh, typically in various different business units. So one could be in HR, one could be in purchasing. Doesn't really matter. But what happens is some unit of the organization has a problem, decides that, well, we're data driven. We're going to collect data, analyze the data to make good decisions and to track our progress. So they go and they figure out where's the data. These days, it's very often in this big data lake, right? Not always. It might be in data warehouses, smaller databases. Um, doesn't really matter in terms of being data driven. This is just a notional scenario that is fairly typical. And what you'll see across all 3 of these is while they all may be drawing from the same data lake or the same data warehouse, they're developing slightly different models of the data. And that makes sense, right? If you think about it, and I like to use retail as an example when giving out talks, not because I expect that everyone here is in the retail sector, but because I think most people as consumers have a fairly basic understanding of retail. So something we can all kind of relate to. So if application 1 might be used by your vice president of uh, sales for a particular product line to understand what customers are buying your product and how sales are going and so forth. Um, and so, of course, the models there are going to be created based upon that representation. They're going to be focused around customers and transactions and a little bit of product. Well, application 2 might be looking at your supply chain. How do you get products acquired into the warehouse, potentially built, or sourced from other locations? How do you ship them out to stores? Where do things need to go? So you're going to be pulling from the same corporate data lake potentially, but you have a very, very different model. And this model is going to be much more centered around the product and inventory and shipping and things. And the information about that product that's in this supply chain application is very likely going to look different than what's in the application focused on sales. And this, again, is very, very typical. So you'll get answers from different questions. There's going to be shared data, but everyone is thinking about the data in their own way, applying their own beliefs on top of it to drive those tools to get the answers to the business questions that they need. And this is very normal way to do things. So let's talk next about what value that may bring on the next slide. There are definitely benefits to being data-driven, and I'm not going to spend excessive amount of time. This talk is trying to get us to being data-centric. But obviously, we're going to try to make decisions based on data, not on our feelings, and that typically is a good thing, right? Even if we're wrong, we can collect that data, hopefully learn from it, maybe see what happened, why things didn't work the way we thought, learn from it, and move from there. So this being able to test our theories with results and learn from them is really, really important. And you can, of course, start to standardize your data and automate certain practices. So things that you may have had to do by hand in the past or that were one-off processes, you can now start to automate because you have this tool set based upon your data. So that's typically a good thing. So let's look at the challenges. Well, one of the main challenges is data is very often duplicated, right? So when we saw that data lake in the middle before, and we saw these applications pulling models out, well, that's true, but it's also often simplistic. The picture was very high level. Those models do get extracted essentially for a particular tool, but that tool then tends to store a subset of that data in the data lake so the tool itself can use it. The tool doesn't typically talk to the data lake directly. It may, but very often you're extracting a subset into a data mart perhaps and using that. So now you have lots of smaller data marts, databases, etc., coming back into existence in addition to your more centralized warehouses or data lakes. And that can lead to a lot of challenges. Uh, you've got a duplication of resources, not just in the data itself, but in terms of the costs required to maintain the hardware, the powered cooling if you're hosting your own, the hosting costs, and certainly the manpower to maintain all the different data stores and those tools. That can be very expensive. You can very often you will see IT shops that are very internally stressed with lots of different demands, and even data sources that are very difficult to get data from now because the demand being placed on them by different organizational units has become so high. One of the things you can also see is sort of these data empires cropping up. And what I mean by that is this is back to a cultural challenge that we get. You'll often see that when an organization puts in a lot of effort to create this specialized model around a business problem, pull the data, um, transform it, cleanse it, massage it into the right shape, and then apply some value to it. Other adjacent organizations may want some of that information for their tool, and you can often hit friction between these two. Ideally, they would just share the information, the data, the model, but often you can get um, sort of internalized resource fighting, as I'm sure many of you have seen, around who controls this data, uh, why should I give you the data, et cetera. And of course, it makes it very difficult to create any kind of IT standards and things around this. So let's move past data-driven now and start talking about, actually, first, let me give some more specific examples. So places you may see this concretely, back in retail. Again, I see this all the time. You'll see retailers that have the same product. So maybe they're selling you the same pen or the same coat, whatever it might be, in a physical store as well as online. And yet they end up with a massive problem because very often the SKU, that internal number for it, is completely different based upon whether that item is sold online versus in the store. And that tends to be a result of these data silos cropping up internally. Someone created a tool to track in-store sales and manage that and profitability. And then someone else created a different tool when the online sector became important, and they're tracking it differently, pulling different data, and now you're creating these problems. And then once that's happened, reconciling them can be a nightmare. Cross-functional reporting can also be very challenging. You'll very often see this when gathering financial information. I've seen this in very large medical systems where a CFO even of the entire organization will ask a simple question like, how much business are we doing with a particular hospital? This is a medical supplier. And that can take, I've seen that take weeks and weeks because all the different business units have defined customers and the supply chain and so forth a little bit differently and built different tools at the corporate center. And gathering all of that information together into one place becomes extremely challenging and can take a very long time. And then even reconciling that information, it doesn't always match up to say what the core financial systems are saying. So I've seen situations where those systems individually might say we did X amount of total business, and then the main corporate finances that are run by accounting says, well, that doesn't match at all. And again, that becomes extremely difficult to reconcile. And then it goes to the IT. Every new project tends to want a new data mart, a new data warehouse, because they don't want to deal with that main corporate data lake or data warehouse. So now we'll actually move on to data centricity on the slide. So I talked a bit about being data driven. Again, it's typically the first step. What is data centric? Well, once again, it's primarily a cultural change, and it's a different way of looking at it. In data centric, we said we're going to use data, and then of course tools we build on the data to help make decisions about how to run our business. Now we're saying the data is really the most important thing about the business, right? So, like, one way to think about this, you think about Google. You say, "Oh, what is Google originally?" You thought, "Oh, Google's a search engine company." They would tell you, "No, they're a data company." Same thing with Facebook. What are they about? They're a data company. They're not about a social media platform. That's just how they gather our data. Their data is the most important thing, and that's a big cultural change. Applications tend to become transient, meaning that you'll have a business problem, and because businesses, of course, change and the business landscape changes, you'll create an application to solve that. But you're going to evolve and probably move beyond that, and that application may very well go away because it's the data that's important and what you do with it, not so much the tool itself. The number one way to get there, or one of the most important aspects of getting to this data-centric approach, is to create a shared model. This is really important. And it's also important to understand that this model is going to be evolving. It's not something we're going to create once. It's not a static model, but it's an evolving model that applies a holistic view of our enterprise, of our organization, or our business. And this is really super important. It can be challenging to do for sure, but is really the key piece in understanding data centricity. So let's explore that a bit more in the next slide. Here's a notional view of a data-centric enterprise. So here you'll again see we have multiple different applications. We have a data lake and an enterprise data warehouse, just like we had before. The difference in this somewhat, I will admit, crudely presented picture is that I've got this really large shared model that goes across all of those applications. So we're all using the same shared model when we create or deploy any kind of a new tool in the enterprise, regardless of where the actual source data might physically live in the data lake, in enterprise data warehouse, whichever. And that's really a different and important new way of looking at things compared to being data centric. So let's go and explore why that's really critical in the next slide. Yes, it's a shared model. So why do we want to do this? Why do we want to take this time to create this evolving, holistic, um, corporate view, really, of the data? Really, the most important reason, in my belief, is fostering understanding across the enterprise. Fostering understanding. Any organization of size, and really size is probably, more than 4 or 5 people. If you're not all working on the exact same thing, as soon as you have some kind of data or job differentiation in the company, and you're working on different aspects of things, you're big enough for understanding to be an issue. And if we don't all understand the data that drives our business, if we don't understand what we're talking about when we have conversations about that data, we're going to hit a lot of roadblocks in every aspect of our decision making and our organizational structure. And it leads us, the shared model leads to what I like to call a more honest model. What do I really mean by that? It's more honest in that we're looking at the totality of the business as best we all understand it at the moment, and are agreeing on those shared concepts, those shared structures that drive our business. If I go the other way, where we're data driven and I'm creating my own models with an application, I'm going to be looking at the data through the lens of my very specific business problem that I'm building this application to solve. And that, of course, is going to lead me as a human being to apply my biases, my beliefs that exist because I'm an expert in this particular business problem. I'm going to apply those to the data. And I'm typically not going to have much insight into the larger data picture or the context or reason behind it. I want to solve my problem. And so when that happens, the model tends to move away from the reality of how the corporate business really treats and thinks about and acts holistically around the data. So when I say it's a more honest model, I certainly don't mean that anyone is intentionally deceiving or trying to hide things. It's really just that we're trying to remove some of those built-in confirmation biases and other things that can happen when we don't see the entire picture and approach it holistically. It can also directly reduce our costs. Every time we build a new application, so many pieces have to come together, right? Not only does the business have to articulate the problem well enough for IT to understand it and start to build a new solution, that data modeling process that happens in the data-driven view of the world, that says I will model the data out of this data lake, this data warehouse, or wherever it might live, and create my model to fit my problem. That is a super time intensive process, and it typically requires resources that are in very high demand in your enterprise, because again, so many people are doing that, and you don't tend to have a lot of these resources. They tend to be very expensive internal resources. So it becomes a bottleneck and it becomes expensive. So getting rid of that and just agreeing that, oh, this is the shared model we all use. Now, for my application, I might not be dealing with all of it, right? So if I'm dealing with building an application to deal with supply chain, we talked about, I may not care so much about the details of transactions at a given store or traffic in a given store. I'm more interested simply in inventory numbers, perhaps trends of inventory, which are driven by those things, but I don't care about them directly. but I can still acknowledge them and understand them. And then, of course, as we're starting to have conversations across lines of businesses now, this shared model allows us to have more meaningful conversations when you are someone who is in charge of a line of more of a profit center, and you want to make a decision to increase profits, and that in fact impacts supply chain. Well, now we can understand each other better. We have a shared model. We're speaking a shared language. Uh, when you ask me to do something so you can have a big sale, and I explain to you some of the challenges inherent in getting you new product to drive that sale, we can see where that data interacts. And conversely, I understand better, of course, being able to see customer numbers and transaction numbers and understanding what that model is that drives supply chain, why it is you're asking to do this. And honestly, having run many workshops with companies to help them start to build these shared holistic models, that process alone is immensely valuable for the company. So many people come out of these workshops with this completely new understanding of why other business units do things the way they do, and why certain data looks the way it does, and certain other decisions are made um, because of this increased sharing. And that again can lead to an entire new line of business, right? If our data is the most important thing, and we treat it that way, and we start to have a better shared understanding of that data, we can much more easily start to see new ways we can leverage that data uh, for increased whatever it is we want to measure, increased profitability, or whatever it is we're trying to achieve. So uh, really, just a ton of benefits. So let's talk about getting there on the next slides. Um, it's tough to get there, and um, again, the key portion of this that we talked about again, like over and over, to that shared model. And in order to do these things, you have to be able to trust your data. If you're going to be able to make these business decisions, have these conversations, you have to trust the data, you have to trust your colleagues, and trust requires understanding. It's very difficult to trust the data if you don't understand what it means. If we're having a conversation and you use terms about the data that I don't understand, or I don't understand why the numbers look a certain way, what's driving them, why certain relationships between processes in our data exist, it becomes really hard to trust that. And then, of course, make important business decisions on it, because I don't want to make a decision that's bad and is going to negatively impact my job, right? So that trust requires understanding the same model all across the organization so we can agree upon that and have those foundations. So let's move along. Again, as I mentioned, when you're doing data centricity, you're really looking through a keyhole. Said you're looking for that very narrow view of your company's data, seen through the lens of your particular problem. And leaders need to understand the bigger picture. The context of your data matters, and data driven can be great, but you're losing the context so often there. So you might be answering a question, and the answer might be correct, but the lack of the context, you might completely be missing an understanding of why that is happening. Why is this trend occurring? Yes, you're right. You thought this trend was going to occur. It is occurring, but it may not be occurring for the reasons you thought, and it may be something else completely external to your problem and much larger. So that context is absolutely critical, and we've got to have that larger picture, that shared data model for that. So I hope there's some value you were to pull out of this. I hope there's someone actually here. My contact information is here, my email, my cell phone number even, as well as my Twitter handle, although I don't post a ton on there. I do have a Q&A session following this. So hopefully I'll see Evan over there to follow up any questions you might have. And thank you for attending my talk. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.